There are moments that arrive quietly. No raised voices, no slammed doors. Only a woman standing at a side table with cut flowers in her hands, speaking in the unhurried tone of someone remarking on the weather. While across the room, a man's pen stops moving, and the silence that follows fills the study like water filling a room. Augusta Trent had been in Ellsbury House less than 20 minutes when she said the thing that could not be unsaid. And Maximilian Hartford, Duke of Ellsbury, who had spent 6 years believing himself invisible, understood in the space of a single held breath that he had been seen all along. He was 42 years old, widowed 3 years, and had carried his secret so carefully and for so long that he had begun to mistake the weight of it for the ordinary gravity of being alive. She was 38, unmarried by choice, and she had come with hyacinths and a charitable subscription card and the precise, unhurried patience of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment. What happened next would cost them both more than either had yet calculated. And it would begin, as the most consequential things often do, with flowers. The morning light fell in long pale bars across the Mayfair study, cutting through the tall windows and catching the dust that moved in the air above Maximilian Hartford's desk. He was writing, or had been writing, a letter to his solicitor regarding the transfer of certain funds through a third account, the kind of transaction that required careful language and a steady hand. Augusta Trent stood at the side table near the window, her back to him, drawing stems of cut hyacinth from their paper wrapping and setting them one by one into the crystal vase his housekeeper had provided. She had brought them herself, carried from her own garden courier that morning, and had explained this to the butler with the easy confidence of a woman who understood that the best way to make an unusual request seem ordinary was to accompany it with a flower. She had been in the room 7 minutes. Maximilian had received her with formal civility and returned immediately to his desk, attending to her with perhaps a quarter of his attention. This was, Augusta had noted, precisely what she had expected. She set the fourth stem into the vase, straightened it slightly, and said without turning, "I had tea with her yesterday. She seemed well, though she is worried about the leak in the back window." The scratching of the pen stopped. Augusta selected a fifth stem and considered its angle. Behind her, she heard nothing, not a word, not a movement. Then, softly, the sound of something rolling across the surface of the desk. The pen, she thought. He has dropped the pen. She arranged 3 more stems before she spoke again, her voice carrying the same absent conversational ease it had carried a moment before. "I think it is time we talked, Your Grace." Still he said nothing. Augusta set the last stem into the vase and turned. Maximilian Hartford was sitting very still at his desk. The pen lay near the edge of the blotter, where it had rolled and stopped. His hands were flat on the surface of the desk, not gripping it, not braced against it, simply resting there with the deliberate stillness of a man who has decided that the worst thing he can do in this moment is move. He was looking at her with an expression she had seen once before, on a general in a painting at the National Gallery. A man who has just understood that the terrain is entirely different from what his maps described. Augusta held his gaze and waited. He was, she knew, doing several things at once. He was assessing her, measuring the distance between what she had said and what she could possibly know, tracing back through the last weeks to determine where the gap in his precautions had been, calculating whether she was a threat or an ally, or something more dangerous than either. He was also, beneath all of that calculation, experiencing something he had not experienced in 6 years. The particular vertiginous sensation of being known. She did not press him. She understood that the next words out of his mouth would tell her more than anything she had spent 2 years observing, and she was patient enough to let him arrive at them himself. The silence stretched. A coal shifted in the grate. Outside, a carriage passed on the street below, and the sound of the horses faded. Then Maximilian said, with great care, "Miss Trent, I am not certain I understand what you mean." Augusta reached for her gloves, which she had set on the corner of the side table when she arrived. "Yes, you are," she said pleasantly. He said nothing to this. His eyes had not moved from her face, and there was something in them now. Not anger, not fear exactly, but the sharp and painful clarity of a man who has just understood that the thing he believed he had kept perfectly hidden has been sitting in plain sight for longer than he knows. Augusta drew on the first glove. "When you are ready to stop carrying this alone," she said, "send for me. I will come within the hour." She drew on the second glove, picked up her card case from the side table, and walked to the door. She did not look back. She had said what she came to say, and she had learned what she came to learn. He had not denied it. He had not performed confusion. He had simply gone still, as a man goes still when he has been found out by someone who already knows the whole of it and has come not to accuse him, but to help. That was enough. She was in her Marylebone rooms by noon. At 6:30 that evening, a footman arrived with a folded note on Ellsbury House stationery. 3 words in a clear and formal hand. She read it aloud, quietly to herself. "Please come now." Augusta set down her book, told her maid to have the carriage brought round, and was at Ellsbury House within the hour, as she had promised. But to understand what happened in that study, it is necessary to step back 1 week, to the morning Augusta arrived in London at the start of the season, when the reason she gave for being there was a charitable subscription card, and the reason she was actually there was considerably more serious. She had taken rooms in Marylebone, a respectable address without the social weight of Mayfair, and she had come with a single maid, a trunk of plain but well-made clothes, and the accumulated knowledge of 2 years of careful watching. Her aunt, Mrs. Hollowell of Kent, had died in the spring of 1820, leaving Augusta a modest legacy, a house in the country, and something the will did not mention: a network of women across 3 counties, a system of houses and routes and assumed names, and the responsibility for the lives of the women moving through it. Augusta had been part of the work since she was 26. She understood the financial channels, the cover identities, the careful language of letters that said one thing on their surface, and something entirely different to the person who knew how to read them. She had learned of Sophia Hartford 2 years before her London visit, through a contact in Hampstead who had noticed an unusual pattern of quarterly payments moving through a solicitor's account. She had traced the payments carefully over several months, until she understood what they were for and who was making them. She had known for 2 years then that the Duke of Ellsbury was hiding his sister in a Hampstead cottage under the name Mrs. Linnet. She had also known, for the last 6 months of those 2 years, that Lord Carrington had begun asking questions, not loudly, not obviously, but with the quiet, methodical persistence of a man who had spent 8 years looking and was beginning to narrow his search. The question she had come to London to answer was not whether the Duke needed help. He did. The question was whether he was the kind of man to whom help could be offered. She observed him at 2 social events in the first 5 days. The first was a dinner at Lord Fenwick's. A large party, 30 covers, the kind of evening where a man's social management could be watched without his being aware of it. She watched how Maximilian handled silences. He used them deliberately, as instruments. She watched how he protected information. He answered questions with questions, redirecting with a fluency that suggested long practice. She watched whether he could be read. He could not, quite, not by the people around him, who took his formalese at face value. Augusta was not the people around him. The second occasion was a morning concert at Grosvenor Square, smaller and quieter, where she had the opportunity to observe him in conversation with two men she knew by reputation. One of them, a former associate of Carrington's. She watched Maximilian's face as Carrington's name was mentioned, casually, in passing. His expression did not change, but his right hand, resting on his knee, closed very briefly around nothing, and then opened again. She returned each evening to her Marylebone rooms and wrote nothing down. On the 6th morning, she ordered hyacinths from her own garden courier and sent a card to Ellsbury House. Now, in the lamplit study that same evening, in answer to his summons, Augusta sat across from Maximilian Hartford and told him, slowly and in pieces, what she knew. Sophia's survival, the Hampstead cottage, the name Mrs. Linnet, the laundered accounts moving through the solicitor in Chancery Lane. She told him about her aunt's network. Not the full shape of it, not yet, but enough to establish what it was and what it could do. She told him she had met Sophia twice, 2 years before, and that Sophia had asked her to wait until she judged the Duke ready. Maximilian confirmed nothing aloud. He sat across from her in the wing-backed chair with his hands clasped and his face entirely composed, and he listened to everything she said without interrupting once. But his face confirmed every word. When she mentioned the solicitor's name, something moved behind his eyes. When she said Sophia's name without the cover name, not Mrs. Linnet, but Sophia, his sister, he drew one slow breath through his nose and released it. Augusta did not press for acknowledgement. When she had finished, she looked at him across the low table and waited. He asked one question. "Ready for what?" he said. "For help," Augusta replied. They went to Hampstead together the following morning, the fog so thick it softened the city into outlines. Augusta sat across from him in the carriage and said little. Maximilian said less. He had the look of a man who had slept badly and was disciplining himself not to show it, which Augusta recognized because she had seen it in the mirror that morning herself. The cottage was small and well kept, set back from a quiet lane, with a garden that was just beginning to show the first green of early spring. Augusta knocked. There was a brief pause, and then the door opened. Sophia Hartford, Mrs. Linnet to the lane, to the local shops, to the woman who brought the milk, was 34 years old, slight and fair, with the composed face of a woman who had learned to live inside a very small perimeter. She looked at Augusta first, and her expression shifted immediately into something warm and unguarded. She stepped forward and embraced her, briefly but without hesitation, with the ease of two women who knew each other well enough to dispense with ceremony. Then she looked past Augusta's shoulder at her brother, and her composure held, but only just. "Max," she said. Maximilian was standing very still on the step. He was looking at the way his sister had embraced Augusta, the ease of it, the familiarity. And the calculation that had carried him through the morning carriage ride was quietly coming apart. "Come inside," Sophia said. "Both of you. The kettle is on." They sat at the small parlor table over tea, and Sophia told him plainly, with the directness of a woman who had lived alone long enough to have no patience for circumlocution, that she and Augusta had met twice in the spring of 1820, through Augusta's aunt, that she had known for 2 years that Augusta was watching him, that she had asked Augusta to wait until she was satisfied he was ready to accept what she was offering. Maximilian sat with this for a long moment. Then he said, "You asked her to wait." "Yes," Sophia said. "You have known for 2 years," he said, "that someone was, that you were not." He stopped. He tried again. "I have spent 6 years," he said, "believing that the fewer people who knew, the safer you were." "I know," Sophia said, gently but without apology. "And for the first 4 years, you were right. But Max, Carrington is not standing still. And you have been." Augusta excused herself at this point, telling them she wished to speak to the housekeeper about the leaking window she had mentioned. She left the siblings alone and spent 20 minutes in the kitchen with Mrs. Hatch, who showed her the damp patch beneath the back window frame, and accepted Augusta's suggestion about a local carpenter with the gratitude of a woman who had been raising the issue for months without result. When Augusta returned to the parlor, Maximilian's expression had changed. The careful formality he had worn all morning, the composed, self-contained manner of a man who had decided exactly how much of himself he would allow to be visible, was gone. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his hands loose in front of him, and he looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man rather than a title. As they left the cottage an hour later and stepped back into the fog, the lane was slick with the morning's damp. Augusta moved forward, and her foot found the worst of it. Before she could adjust her balance, Maximilian's hand was at the small of her back, steadying her across the stretch of wet cobblestone. He kept it there longer than the crossing required. Augusta did not move away. They reached the drier ground on the other side, and his hand remained for one more moment. And then he withdrew it, and they walked on, and neither of them said a word. He was no longer alone in this. He was not entirely certain how that had happened, or what it would cost him. But he understood that he had crossed a line he could not cross back over. The man who had walked into that cottage this morning had been carrying 6 years of solitary competence like armor. The man who walked out of it was beginning to suspect that what he had called armor was something else entirely. Over the 6 days that followed, Augusta brought him into the working structure of her aunt's network with the methodical clarity of a woman who had been running it alone for 2 years and was done with running it alone. She named the houses, 7 of them, across Kent, Surrey, and Hampshire, and the women who managed each one. She explained the financial channels. Small sums moved through 3 separate accounts, none of them large enough to attract notice, each transaction documented as something innocuous. She described the cover identity system, the names, the histories, the letters of character that could be produced on 48 hours' notice. Maximilian listened to all of it and brought what he had. Money, real money, not the careful trickle of laundered quarterly payments, but the kind of sum that could move a woman and establish her in a new life without leaving a trail. Legal cover through his solicitor, a man named Graves, who had been managing the Linnet accounts for 6 years and who, it emerged, had known the general shape of the situation without being told the specifics. And access to private transportation, his own carriages, his own horses, his own coachman who had learned over 6 years not to ask where they were going. They worked well together. They also argued twice. The first argument was about Sophia. Augusta had been looking at the timing and the pattern of Carrington's recent movements, and she believed Sophia should be moved from Hampstead sooner than the plan allowed. Within the week, rather than in 3 weeks' time, as Maximilian had arranged. "Move her now," Augusta said. They were in the Hampstead kitchen, Sophia having gone to the market, the maps spread across the table between them. The longer she stays in a location Carrington's people have had time to identify, the more dangerous it becomes. She is settled here, Maximilian said. Mrs. Hatch knows the routine. Moving her disrupts everything we have built. What you have built, Augusta said, with the patience of someone explaining something to a man who is intelligent enough to understand it and stubborn enough to resist it, is a position that Carrington has had 6 years to find. The fact that he hasn't found it yet does not mean the position is safe. It means he hasn't finished looking. 3 weeks, Maximilian said. The arrangements are made. Graves has the documentation. 2 weeks, Augusta said. I will have the documentation ready in 2 weeks. And if anything changes before then, if there is any indication that Carrington's attention is moving toward Hampstead, we move immediately, regardless of whether the documentation is complete. He conceded the 2 weeks. He did not apologize for the 3. The second argument was about Lady Marwood, whose name Augusta raised on the 4th day, and whose potential usefulness Maximilian immediately opposed. Bringing the Home Secretary's wife into this, he said, means the network is no longer invisible. The moment Lady Marwood knows, her husband knows, and the moment her husband knows, every file in Whitehall with Carrington's name on it is at risk of being opened. Or closed, Augusta said. You cannot know which. I know Lady Marwood, Augusta said. I have known her for 4 years. She has held something for me, something relevant to this situation, for the past year, waiting for the right moment to use it. The right moment is coming. I am telling you about her now because when I make the decision to play that card, I will not have time to explain it first. Then explain it now, Maximilian said. Not yet, Augusta said. When the time comes. He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who was unaccustomed to being told not yet by anyone, and was discovering that it was possible to be frustrated and reassured simultaneously. Augusta looked back at him steadily. Neither apologized. Both, in their own way, conceded something. On the evening of the 5th day, Sophia had gone to bed early, and Augusta and Maximilian were at the kitchen table going over the relocation routes, 3 possible roads south, 2 possible staging points, the timing of each. The lamp was low, and the fire had burned down to embers, and the house was quiet in the way houses become quiet when the person who makes them feel inhabited has gone to sleep. Augusta was tracing a road on the map with her finger when Maximilian reached across the table and took her hand. It was not a romantic gesture. It was the gesture of a man who has just understood something large and cannot find words for it, who reaches for the hand of the person who has changed the shape of what he thought he knew. Because the hand is there, and the words are not. He held it for the length of a quiet sentence, perhaps 8 seconds, and then released it. Augusta looked down at the map and continued talking about the road through Reigate. Maximilian picked up his pencil and made a note in the margin. He had been calling it discretion for 6 years. He was beginning to understand, slowly and with the resistance of a man who had built his identity around a particular kind of competence, that discretion was not the right word for what he had been doing. Discretion was a tool. What he had been doing was something lonelier than that, and considerably less effective. And he had only just begun to see it clearly because the woman across the table had shown him what it looked like from the outside. Lord Carrington arrived at Ellsbury House on a Tuesday morning, announced as a courtesy call. A mutual acquaintance, Lord Fenwick, whose dinner Augusta had attended the week before, had vouched for him, and Maximilian had received him in the drawing room with the formal civility that was his default armor. Augusta was present. She had come that morning on the pretext of returning a borrowed volume of botanical illustrations to the library. A reason thin enough that she and Maximilian had exchanged a brief look when she arrived, but sufficient for the servants. She was seated near the window with the book in her lap when Carrington was shown in. He was charming. This was the first thing Augusta registered. Not his appearance, not his rank, but the quality of his charm, which was the practiced, frictionless charm of a man who had learned very early that people are more easily managed when they like you. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the easy confidence of someone who had spent the last decade accumulating influence at Whitehall and had grown comfortable with the weight of it. He spoke of mutual acquaintances. He expressed admiration for the house. He mentioned, with the idle pleasure of a man making conversation, that he had been spending time recently in the northern parts of the city, Hampstead in particular. What a pleasant part of London, he said. He had heard the Duke kept a small property there. He smiled. He set his card on the silver tray that the footman held. He acknowledged Augusta with a brief, pleasant bow. "Miss Trent, I believe?" "A pleasure," and left. The moment the drawing-room door closed, Maximilian went white. He stood in the center of the room and did not move. He was looking at the silver tray where Carrington's card lay, and his face had the quality of a man who has just heard the specific sound that means the thing he feared is no longer approaching. It has arrived. Augusta crossed the room and sat down on the nearest chair without being invited. 36 hours, she said. Perhaps less. He knows the property exists. He may already know more than that. Maximilian turned to look at her. "I have a network," Augusta said. "I have told you the shape of it. Now I am telling you what it can do. I can move Sophia tonight if necessary. I can have a new identity ready by morning. I can reach 3 houses between here and the coast before Carrington's men have finished watching this one." She paused. "But I need you to stop trying to manage this alone. I need you to tell me everything you haven't yet told me. And I need you to trust that I am not going to misuse it." Maximilian looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Why?" he said. "Have you been waiting 2 years to offer this?" "Because I had to be certain," Augusta said, "that you were a man worth trusting twice." Something shifted in his face. He looked at her, really looked at her, with the calculation gone, with the careful formality stripped away, with the 6 years of solitary management laid bare. And what remained was a man who was tired and frightened for his sister, and had just been told, plainly, that the woman across from him had been protecting Sophia in a way he hadn't known was possible. "Why now?" he asked. And the question was different from the last one, quieter, more personal. "Because Carrington is running out of time," Augusta said. "And so are you. And I decided, when I watched you at Fenwick's dinner, that you were ready to know it." That night, while Augusta sent urgent word through her network, and Maximilian sat in his study going over every document that connected Ellsbury House to the Hampstead property, Carrington's men took up quiet positions in the street outside. The siege had begun. Sophia was moved from Hampstead in the dead of night, 3 days earlier than the revised plan had allowed. Augusta's network moved with the quiet efficiency of long practice. A carriage from a house in Islington, a driver who knew 3 different roads out of the city, a change of horses arranged at a posting inn in Bromley. Sophia left with 2 trunks, Mrs. Hatch, and the composed face of a woman who had been waiting for this moment and was simply relieved it had finally come. Maximilian brought Lily. His 4-year-old daughter had been at Ellsbury House under the care of her nurse, and he had looked at the situation. Carrington's men in the street, the surveillance already established, the unpredictability of what the next 48 hours might bring. and decided he would not leave a child in a house where Carrington had reason to reach. He carried Lily to the carriage himself. Wrapped in a blanket, already half asleep, one small hand gripping his lapel. Augusta, watching from the doorway, said nothing. But she noted the way he settled the child against his shoulder, and the way his hand moved to cover her head as he ducked into the carriage. And she filed it away, with everything else she had learned about him. The safe house outside Tunbridge Wells was a farmhouse belonging to a woman in Augusta's network. Mrs. Crane, a widow of 60, who had been part of the operation since Augusta's aunt had established it. It was warm and plain, and far enough from London that the sound of the city did not reach it. Sophia and Lily were installed upstairs. Mrs. Hatch made tea. The ordinary machinery of survival began to turn. The following morning, Augusta received word from Mrs. Hatch, who had stayed behind in Hampstead for exactly this purpose, that a man had come to the cottage with a document he described as a warrant. He had been polite, Mrs. Hatch said, in her brief letter. She had been polite in return. She had told him that Mrs. Linnet had left for Bath 3 days ago, that she herself was staying on to close up the house, and that she was sorry she could not be more helpful. He had thanked her and left. Augusta read the letter at the kitchen table that evening and passed it to Maximilian without comment. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the table and said, "How did she know what to say?" "I told her," Augusta said, "before we left. I told her what to say if anyone came, and I told her what to say if they pressed her, and I told her what to say if they came back." Maximilian looked at the letter for another moment. "You prepared for this before we moved Sophia?" "Yes," Augusta said. "Before Carrington's card arrived?" "Yes," Augusta said. "I prepared for it the week I arrived in London. I told you, I came this season specifically because Carrington was getting closer. I had already decided that when we moved, we would need the cottage to tell a story behind us." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had not thought of that." "No," Augusta said, not unkindly. "You were thinking about the move. I was thinking about what comes after the move." The window had closed faster than either of them had calculated. That night, in the safe house kitchen at 2 a.m, Sophia and Lily, asleep upstairs, rain steady on the windows, the maps spread across the table, and the lamp burning low. Augusta sat with her hands flat on the surface of the table and stopped. She did not move for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely different from her usual tone, "I am very tired of being the only person in the room who knows what is happening." It was the only time in 6 days she had broken in front of him. It was a single sentence, plainly spoken, and it was over almost before it had begun. But it was enough. Maximilian set down his pencil. He crossed the kitchen, sat down on the bench beside her, not across from her, beside her, and put his arm around her shoulders. Not carefully, not tentatively, simply and without ceremony, the way a man sits beside someone who is tired and puts his arm around them, because that is the obvious thing to do. Augusta leaned against him. The rain on the windows was the only sound. They stayed that way for perhaps a quarter of an hour, not speaking, not reviewing maps, not calculating routes. Just sitting in the low lamplight with the rain outside and the quiet house around them, while the weight of 6 days of crisis and 2 years of preparation settled into something that was not quite peace, but was at least shared. Then Augusta straightened, pulled the map toward her, and pointed to a line of road running south. "There," she said. "That is the road we use." Maximilian looked at where she was pointing. He nodded once. They returned to work. On the following afternoon, Augusta told him about Lady Marwood. She had held this back deliberately. Not because she doubted the decision to use it, but because she had needed him to understand the full shape of what they were dealing with before she played the card that would change everything. Now she laid it out for him plainly, at the kitchen table while Mrs. Crane was occupied elsewhere and Lily was in the garden, under Sophia's eye. Lady Marwood, she explained, was the wife of the Home Secretary. She was also a woman who had, over the course of the previous year, come into possession of letters, 4 of them written by 3 different women, documenting the nature of Lord Carrington's conduct before his marriage. 2 of those women were dead. The circumstances of their deaths had not withstood the scrutiny of the 2 people who had looked closely at them, one of whom was Lady Marwood, and the other of whom was Augusta's contact in Hampstead. The letters named dates, places, and specific actions. They were, in the right hands, sufficient to end Carrington's career and his freedom. Maximilian listened to this without moving. "She has held them for a year," he said. "Yes," Augusta said. "Waiting," he said. "Waiting for the right moment," Augusta said. "I told her, when she first came to me, that I would tell her when the moment arrived. I am telling her tonight. I am proposing that we ride to Marwood Park and put the question to her directly." Maximilian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If we bring the Home Secretary's wife into this, the network is no longer invisible. Her husband will know. And when the Home Secretary knows, everything connected to the situation becomes a matter of government record." "The network," Augusta said steadily, "has been visible to Carrington for 6 months. He has been asking questions about me specifically, my movements, my connections, my aunt's former associates. He already knows something exists. The question is not whether to protect the network's invisibility. That protection is already gone. The question is whether we act first, or whether we wait for him to act and respond to whatever he does." Maximilian looked at her for a long moment. "You knew this," he said, "that he had been asking about you? You knew this before you came to London?" "Yes," Augusta said. "And you came anyway?" "Yes," Augusta said, "because coming was the only way to finish it." They rode at midnight, through roads that were dark and empty and cold, reaching Marwood Park as the clock struck 4. Lady Marwood received them in her private sitting room in a dressing gown, with the unhurried composure of a woman who had been expecting this visit for some time. She read the letters Augusta brought, her own copies, confirming what Lady Marwood already held, by candlelight, at the small desk near the window. Then she looked up and agreed, without hesitation, to place the letters in her husband's hands at breakfast. Then she told them something Augusta had not known. "Carrington has been calling in favors all week," Lady Marwood said, her voice quiet but entirely certain. "He has spoken to 3 men in the Home Office and 2 in the Foreign Secretary's department. He intends to have the woman found within a fortnight, and he intends to use legal means, a warrant, a constable, a magistrate's order, which will make it very difficult for anyone to intervene without appearing to obstruct the law." She looked at Augusta directly. "The handover you have planned for 3 days from now cannot happen in 3 days. It must happen tomorrow night." Augusta absorbed this without visible reaction. Then she said, "I understand. Thank you." Riding back through the dawn, the countryside gray and still around them, Maximilian spoke. He told her what the 6 years had cost. He told her about the morning in 1820 when the letter had arrived from Italy. Not the letter reporting Sophia drowned, which had come 2 years before, but the letter from a woman he had never met, a Mrs. Hollowell of Kent, telling him his sister was alive and needed help. He told her how he had responded, Alone, immediately, with the absolute certainty of a man who had always managed difficult things by managing them himself. He told her about the accounts, the lawyers, the cover name, the quarterly visits to Hampstead that he had arranged to look like business in the northern parts of the city. He told her about the morning 3 years ago, 3 weeks after his wife died in childbed, when he had sat beside the bed where Lily was sleeping and had thought about writing to someone, anyone, to say, "I cannot do this alone anymore." He had thought about it for the length of time it took Lily to wake up and reach for him. And then he had decided against it, because the decision to tell someone was also the decision to put that person at risk. And he had decided he had no right. He told her this in a steady voice, looking at the road between his horse's ears. And when he had finished, he said nothing else. Augusta had listened without interrupting. She said nothing for a moment after he finished. Then she said, "I see you, Maximilian. I see exactly what you have done and why you did it and what it has cost you." She paused. "And you are not the only competent person in England. The sooner you fully believe that, not just know it, but believe it, the better the next 24 hours will be for both of us." He turned to look at her across the narrow space between their horses. He said nothing, but something in his face had changed. Something that had been held in careful tension for a very long time had, at last, released. That evening, in a small upstairs room at the Sussex Inn where they had stopped to review the plan before the midnight handover, they went over it 3 times. The church, the contact, the carriage, the road north. The timing, the contingencies. Augusta had a contingency for every contingency, and Maximilian had stopped being surprised by this somewhere around the 2nd day, and had begun simply to be grateful. When they had been over it a 3rd time and there was nothing left to review, Augusta rose and reached for her traveling cloak. Maximilian was standing near the door. He turned toward her, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he said, "Augusta." Just her name, nothing else. He kissed her slowly, with the steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it, who has looked at the cost of what tomorrow might bring and has decided that this one thing will be said tonight, regardless of what follows. Augusta stood very still for a moment, and then she kissed him back with the same steadiness, the same deliberateness, the same quality of a choice made clearly and without reservation. The inn was quiet. Somewhere below, a fire was burning. Outside, the Sussex night was dark and cold and perfectly still. At midnight, Sophia Hartford waited inside a small Sussex parish church, dressed for travel under her 3rd identity. A name Augusta's network had prepared, with letters of character, a history, and a destination in a Scottish parish where a woman named Mrs. Crane's cousin would receive her. She sat in the front pew with her hands folded and her face composed, and she listened to the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old building, and she waited. She heard them before she saw them. Footsteps on the gravel path outside, not one set, not 2, but several, moving with the deliberate quiet of men who believed they were being careful. Augusta and Maximilian were near the church door. Maximilian heard the footsteps and went still. And then he moved toward the door, the gesture of a man who has spent 6 years being the only person standing between his sister and the thing that was hunting her, and who is not capable of stopping that instinct even now. Augusta put her hand on his arm. "Wait," she said. He looked at her. "The letters," she said. "Lady Marwood. The Home Secretary's breakfast table this morning. There is a warrant being drawn up in London right now, not for Sophia, for Carrington." She met his eyes. He does not know that yet. I do. Let me go. He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had come to him with hyacinths and a charitable subscription card and the whole weight of her aunt's life's work and 2 years of careful watching, and who was now proposing to walk alone into a churchyard at midnight to face a man who had spent 8 years searching for the woman inside this building. He stepped back. Augusta walked out. The churchyard was cold and still, the gravestones pale shapes in the darkness. Carrington stood 20 feet from the church door with 3 men behind him. He was wearing a greatcoat and carrying a lantern, and when Augusta stepped out of the church and into the light of it, he looked at her with the careful attention of a man cataloging a surprise. "Miss Trent," he said. "What an unexpected—" "Lord Carrington," Augusta said. Her voice was entirely level. "I have 4 letters. They were written by 3 women you knew between 1810 and 1815. 2 of those women are dead. The letters name dates, locations, and the precise nature of what occurred. Lady Marwood has held them for 1 year. This morning at breakfast, she placed them in her husband's hands." Carrington was very still. "The Home Secretary," Augusta continued, "is not a man who moves slowly when he has sufficient cause. You have until dawn to leave England. After dawn, I cannot speak to what the warrant will say or where it will be served." One of Carrington's men shifted his weight. Another looked sideways at Carrington and then away. The lantern light moved slightly in the cold air. Carrington looked at Augusta for a long moment. His face was unreadable, or almost unreadable. There was something behind his eyes that might have been calculation and might have been the particular cold recognition of a man who has just understood that the ground has been pulled from beneath him by someone he did not think to watch. He turned away. "Come," he said to his men, and the word was quiet and entirely final. They were gone in 5 minutes. The gravel of the path was silent. The churchyard was empty. Augusta stood in the cold for a moment, then turned and walked back to the church door. Maximilian was standing in the doorway. He had watched the whole of it. Augusta's voice, Carrington's stillness, the moment the men had looked at each other and understood it was over. And his face, as she reached him, was not the face of the composed and formal Duke who had received her in his study 10 days ago. It was something considerably more honest than that. Inside the church, Sophia was already on her feet. The contact, a woman named Mrs. Price, who had driven down from Surrey that afternoon, was waiting near the side door with a different carriage than the one they had planned, on a different road than the one Carrington would expect. Maximilian walked to his sister and stood with her for a moment in the quiet of the old building, out of the cold, away from the night. He said something to her, low and private. She answered. He took her hands and held them for a moment. Then he let go. Sophia embraced Augusta at the side door, briefly and with great feeling. "Tell me when you are settled," Augusta said. "I will write within the week," Sophia said. Then she looked at Augusta with the particular clarity of a woman who has been watching 2 people very carefully for 10 days. And she said nothing more, because nothing more was needed. The carriage took her north. Maximilian came out of the church and stood on the steps and watched the carriage until it disappeared into the dark of the road. Augusta stood beside him. The night was cold and quiet, and the churchyard smelled of stone and old grass, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called once and was silent. He turned to her. He said her name and kissed her in the dark. And this time there was nothing measured in it. No calculation, no reservation, only the plain and certain feeling of a man who has just watched the woman beside him walk into danger alone and win, and who understands, fully and without qualification, what that means. 2 weeks later, at Ellsbury House, the hyacinths on the side table had been replaced by irises. From a different garden, a different courier. Augusta was arranging them in the early morning light, her back to the room, her mind moving through the quiet calculations that were, for her, simply the texture of ordinary thought. She heard Maximilian cross the room behind her. He reached around her and took the flowers gently from her hands and set them on the table. Then he took her hand and led her toward the door of the study. The fire had burned low. The house was quiet. Lily was asleep upstairs. The next image was morning light through a window neither of them had seen before. A different window in a different room, with the particular quality of early light that belongs to the first morning in a new place. 2 cups of tea stood on a single tray on the table beside the bed. And on the desk across the room, where Maximilian had set the Morning Post before the day had properly begun, there lay a letter in a careful, unfamiliar hand, postmarked from a parish in Perthshire, signed with the name Mrs. Linnet. "The garden is taking well," the letter read, and she was settled. The neighbors were kind, and the house was dry. She had everything she needed. She thanked them both. She was well. Augusta read it first, then passed it to Maximilian. He read it standing by the window in the morning light, and when he had finished, he set it down on the desk and was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his cup of tea and held it out to Augusta, who took it, and held out her hand for his, and they stood together in the new light of the morning, with the letter on the desk behind them, and the whole of what they had done settled quietly between them, earned and real and entirely worth the cost of it.